Okay. Hi, Marian.
Hi, Liv. Do you wanna I think you're up first.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Great Careers Program. This is a show for anyone who has ever worked in a school and thought that preparing young people for their future has to be about more than good grades, glossy pathways poster, and one heroic careers person with a very full inbox. I'm Liv Penny.
I feel so bad for that person. And I'm Marian, right? Today is a bit of a milestone because we have our first ever official guest on the podcast.
Woohoo.
Cue the cheering sounds. And we wanted to say something about that before we bring him in because guests are definitely not here to be a decoration or because we ran out of things to talk about. I mean,
For
that doesn't
sure.
really ever happen with us. Although, Liv, episode 3 does feel a little bit early to be going global.
Yeah, we're going big early.
But the reason we would like a guest to be a part of this conversation is because career education touches so many parts of a huge system that school is only one part of. Liv and I often can zoom into young people and then zoom out at a school level, but sometimes we actually need someone who is closer to that particular part of the terrain. And if we're going to do this well and we're going to really make an impact for young people, then we need to collaborate amongst all the systems who are part of this so that we build that shared responsibility and acknowledge the interconnections in this work.
Yeah, I think because so many of us are busy in the bit we can see, whereas for the young person and for their future it is that lifelong piece. So often when we've been to, I've gone to career development conferences for schools, they're looking at that one little piece, or for unis, they're looking at their little piece, or they have those young people for their fixed amount of time. So really important, and it often gets lost that the whole system is interconnected, and that for those young people sitting in a school, they are looking ahead despite and through all the different parts of the systems at their future. So really good to get those guests in that can give us that different perspective and join the dots a little bit. Today's terrain that we're talking about is a huge one. AI and rapid technological change are for sure reshaping the world of work. And you can't open a news feed or a paper if that's your style, or LinkedIn without seeing that headline stories, facts, stats, forecasts. And it's changing not just the jobs people do, but how they enter professions, develop expertise within those professions, and build careers over time. So because all that's changing, the way young people enter jobs and encounter the early parts of their career is also changing. And for us adults that are already in the workforce, we have no choice but to, work it out as we go along. We're all learning to navigate this together. But for young people sitting in a school, it's landing differently. Many of them are seeing and hearing of those that are just a few years ahead of them, who are starting to seriously and publicly challenge that pathway that they've been told to trust for forever, and that as society and media, we've all kind of laid out and accepted as a good pathway, which is that promise of work hard at school, get good grades, go to university if you can, and the opportunities will follow.
Now, we feel it's important to be straight up and say this is not going to be another AI is taking all of the jobs out there episode, but it's also not going to be, hey, just learn AI and you'll be fine and you'll keep up type of episode either.
Yeah, and definitely not that we have all the answers. Somewhere between that doom and gloom that the young people are hearing about and the hype of, get on board and embrace everything, is a much more useful and honest conversation about where we're at, what we know and what we don't know. So we might not be able to give young people certainty about the future, we never have, but we can help them understand what those challenges are, make sense of the signals that we can see, and help them develop the skills they'll need to navigate whatever comes next.
And because this conversation extends well beyond schools, we're very excited to welcome our first ever guest to the podcast. Chris Webb is joining us all the way from the UK. Chris is a registered career development professional who works in the university career sector and has been right up close to the changing graduate labour market, the role of AI in career development, and the way that uncertainty is landing for students. He is also the creator of The Week in Careers, which is a newsletter I read. I'm very proud to say I subscribe to. And I am one of 5,000 subscribers who engage with Chris's updates, and I can say that they are excellent. Chris is the co creator of the 4C framework, a writer, a trainer, and a consultant. And he also co hosted an awesome careers podcast for 5 years. So for us newbies at episode 3, we have a bit of imposter syndrome going into this.
I also want to quote something written about Chris recently by Lady Mohammed Chapman in the UK. She described Chris on LinkedIn as one of the most trusted voices in the careers sector and said that what she loves about him in particular is that he's willing to challenge the work that's coming out, not just applaud everything and celebrate everything in the careers space. My favourite line of her big testimonial and her Tuesday shout out to him was that Chris contributes beyond his day job and that his portfolio, as Marian just read out, is vast, and it's not a portfolio built for visibility, it's a portfolio built for impact. Chris, welcome to the Great Careers Programme. We are so excited to have you here as our first ever guest.
We are going to get you to join us for our regular segment, which is called I Didn't Know That Was a Thing, where we look at a job or a role that reminds us that the world of work is always stranger, wider, and way more interesting than the career posters on our classrooms might actually suggest.
Yeah, and to prove every week that even as career development professionals right in the deep of it, looking at careers all the time, I still every day find something I didn't know was a thing. So that's what we're trying to model. What have you got for us, Chris?
Well, it has obviously been the World Cup recently, so I thought let's kind of go with something around that theme. And this is sort of something I didn't know was a thing for quite a long period of my life. And I found out about it through a friend of mine who I went to university with, who was quite heavily involved in football and football clubs. It turned out that what he did was he worked as a kind of player liaison officer or a player welfare, player care officer. They have kind of different titles for them. And it's a really cool and kind of quite interesting role because it's one of those things where you don't really think about, well, okay, footballers, they travel all over the world. Like sometimes you hear about them moving from, oh, they've just moved to Saudi Arabia, or they were in, Paris Saint-Germain midway through the season, and now they're moving to Chelsea. And what does that look like? And yeah, essentially a lot of the work that he did was around working with players, their families, supporting like the logistics of how do they set up their bank accounts? How do they get their kids moved into a school? Where do they find a house? All of that sort of stuff, visas. And it was, essentially a bit like a concierge for players and looking at player welfare and working really closely with the coaches and really closely with like the operational staff within the club, communicating with the agents of the players and the families of players and all those sorts of things. So I think it's a really interesting role that's kind of quite underexplored when people talk about careers in sports, but you can find them all over. There's lots of them online if you search for that type of job title, and I think some genuinely interesting work that is maybe quite different to what people think of, but actually when you actually step back and think about it, pretty central to kind of how these players are able to get to where they need to go and then be able to kind of play for all these different clubs around the world. So that is my I didn't know it was a thing.
I love it, and I think especially in the field of sport, there's so many, we have so many young people that are like, I'm just going to be in pro sport. And if it's not sport, I'll be a physio. So I think being able to look at all those roles that the invisible jobs around sport. My questions on it would be, are they attached to a club or can they stay with the player? Because I imagine that would be quite disruptive as a player moving to, okay, I had this one player liaison or player development manager here, and now I've got another one. It would be so different every day depending on the agency working with and the player's own kind of character and their parents. Yeah, all of that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, I would imagine there's, this is where there might be a distinction between kind of what agents do versus what maybe a welfare officer or a club would do. Certainly my friend used to work directly for clubs, and I was looking at a couple of online vacancies before I kind of came on the podcast today. And the one that I was looking at was with Tottenham Hotspur in London for sort of an assistant player welfare officer role. And, some of the stuff they include on the job description, serving as the primary point of contact for first team players and families, coordinating international relocations, housing, school, banking, healthcare, visas, supporting players, partners and families, getting them kind of understanding the local area and the club environment. So I think for those type of roles, from what I've seen, they typically tend to be in clubs. But say there's a whole ecosystem there, and for many high profile players, we hear about their agents, people like Fabrizio Romano being almost as well known sometimes as the players. So I think there probably is a bit of a hybrid sometimes of how people do this work. Yeah. But certainly from what I've seen, kind of player welfare officers tend to be kind of club oriented. Yeah.
Yeah, we always talk about, the questions we'd have about the role. Like, what did the critical thinking, it might sound like a great job. What are the things we want to model people being curious about to work out whether it's a good fit for them or not? For me, I think being the one go-to person for everything admin, travel, sad about something, it feels very much like being a mum of teenagers. So I think I'd be awesome at it.
I was curious, Chris, if you knew whether it's something that you, I guess, train and qualify for specifically, or if it's something that you can transition to if you're in the industry. I mean, I would assume you'd have to have a fair amount of industry knowledge to sort of understand some of the nuances, but then also be incredibly networked as well. And the other thing I was thinking as well is, it kind of, I watched The Devil Wears Prada too the other day. And I don't know if you've seen the first one. Oh, did you? Yeah. We can talk about our reviews later. I didn't think it was as good as the first, but no, that's by the by. But like that old thing about like the EA always being on call and having to sort of drop everything as soon as like a crisis goes down or like a flight gets missed. Like I wondered if it was a bit like that. Like you'd always sort of be waiting for like, oh my gosh, like what if the visa doesn't come through? And what if this and the kids and the things? And like, is it a bit like that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you say that, because that's certainly on the job descriptions. They talk about that all the time, weekend work, evening work, fast paced, kind of high pressure, those sort of things, because I guess of who you're working with. And also, as you said, these things don't just come up at normal times in like a 9 to 5 schedule. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that appears kind of quite clearly on sort of job descriptions for the roles. I think that the training and qualifications part is really interesting. So certainly for my friend, he worked in football clubs after university for quite a while, but didn't do any specific training or qualifications to get into this. And when you look at a lot of the job descriptions, interestingly, it's very, very transferable kind of skill type stuff. So they sometimes talk about here previous experience in like player care or sports operations, but they also talk about stuff like luxury lifestyle management or executive support. So that could come back to the Devil Wears Prada type roles. You might have been in that sort of PA role or EA role. In a different industry, you might have been in like, say, hospitality. You might have worked in that sort of sector, but being able to kind of transfer those skills around building high trust relationships, having really strong logistics, planning, organizing skills, great networker, as you mentioned, being well connected with the industry that you're kind of going into. So I think, from what I've seen, and again, I'm not an expert in this particular role, but I've seen it, it's not necessarily a particular qualification, but certainly for people that maybe have been in and around that idea of sports operations, player care, or maybe kind of, luxury relationship management, whatever that sort of looks like. I think that, that there seems to be a lot of commonality.
So I think this is one that would probably go on a heck yes list. I think
that's the first one.
I think so. And Chris, for the record, every time we've done this before, it's been a case of I would never do that. But I think this is something that I don't think I'd get bored doing it. I love the idea of solving some complex problems. I love the idea of like operating in all these different worlds. And I really love the relationship aspect of it. I think it would be really cool to get to know and just work with this one person. And then, like you get this sort of depth in a relationship. What about you, Liv? Would you do it?
I'm a heck yes as well. I think I like things being different every day, and I like the unforeseen challenges that come at you. Which sport? I probably have to think about the sports carefully and whether they'd be very different. Yeah. So would you apply for the Spurs role?
If one came up at Leicester City, I might. Yeah, I think definitely a heck yes for me. Although quite biased, obviously, as I picked it. But I think the being able to work with like so many international people, I think would be really quite cool. You've got so many sort of players coming from all over the world, their families, and bringing sort of different things with them, and obviously that environment changing all the time as players come in and out. So I imagine that would be really interesting. I like relationship building. I quite like, fast-paced work, that sort of thing. So I think you would end up feeling like you had a real sort of community around the work you did. But I would imagine it's also extremely high pressure. And of course, there's so much money in something like football that I wonder how much it would exist in other parts of the sports sector. It
Yeah.
might be that because there's so much money in football, they can afford to do this. But are they doing it all the way down to, say, like League Two or
Yeah.
conference level clubs in the UK? So I'd be interesting to find out a bit more about that. So some research for me to do there.
Well done. You're the first heck yeses, or unanimous heck yes. Well done.
We did it. We did it.
Okay, so normally I'm the one that zooms into the what's happening for our issue, what's the challenge we're talking about, what's happening in the classroom for students and schools and educators on the ground. But this week we're going to flip it around, and we're going to start with the zoom out to what's happening in the world. What we do and don't know about how industry and employers are adopting AI, how that's impacting entry-level jobs, and specifically in this episode, how it's impacting graduate jobs in uni, because for a long time, the preferred pathway, and I think the accepted promise, has been, work hard at school, get good grades, go to uni, get a good job. And that remains the sequence that most media, parents, schools are kind of built around. That is the default path A. So because this is for all educators working in schools who may not be aware of you and your amazing work, and I've also noticed even in the career space that sometimes the tertiary career development people don't know so much about what's happening in school space and vice versa. Can you help us connect the dots a bit from your role to schools and why you're best positioned to help us in this discussion today?
Yeah, well, so first of all, thanks both of you for kind of having me on the podcast. It's, great to kind of talk about this particular topic. So it's one that I could talk about for hours, so I have to try and kind of control myself. So, I guess for people that don't know me, I'm Chris Webb. I'm a career consultant currently working in higher education in the UK, but my background is kind of quite varied in the careers sector. So I've worked across schools, colleges, adult guidance provision. And I think one of my kind of big bugbears is exactly what you've just said, that certainly kind of here in the UK, there's often not the connectivity between careers professionals maybe working in like the secondary school sector, working in kind of further education colleges, working for independent training providers, and those who are kind of working in universities. Like the systems can often feel quite separate. And so I think because I've worked across all three, and I write a regular newsletter called The Week in Careers, which is about bringing together policy and practice, theory from the kind of wider sort of career space. I think for me, I've always seen it as being really, really important that, if we're working in higher education as careers professionals, we're super plugged into what's happening in schools and colleges, because, those are going to be the people that are coming to us. And it's not as if you kind of hit the age of 18 and suddenly a light switches on and you've got everything figured out, which I think sometimes there's that sort of assumption. So I think for me, that's kind of the space that I work across, is that I'm really, really keen on keeping plugged into everything that's happening across the career space and disseminating that to other careers professionals. And then for the last sort of 3.5 years, my focus has really been on, AI and career development and how we're seeing that impact both the wider world of work and also the work of careers professionals. So I feel I've kind of got a few different hats I can sort of put on to talk about the topic we're going to be covering today.
Is why you're perfect to have it, because the reason we're talking about this so early in the series is because this is what we're hearing from schools every day. What do we say to our young people who are just hearing doom and gloom about the future and are questioning that pathway? One school we work with recently said, well, what do I say to this group of year 10s who are questioning everything and just telling me there's no jobs? And I said, well, don't worry, I'm going to go away and I'm going to come back with 10 reasons you can give them to be hopeful. And I was like, right, I know all the data, I read all the reports, but I was really struggling to go hand on heart, here's 10 reasons to be hopeful without giving them the balanced view. Now, I know you're deep in the research and data and unpicking what the truth is. So what are some of the complexities and the myths and the realities behind the numbers that we're seeing? What are the numbers that we're seeing? What are those headlines first?
Yeah, I think that's the really important kind of part of all of this is taking a bit more of a big picture view, because I think there is too much of a focus on kind of headline numbers. So if we think about a few things that have kind of come up recently over the last kind of couple of years, there was that big headline that certainly made a lot of the UK press, that was taken from some Adzuna data, so some job board data, that supposedly showed that entry-level jobs were down by about a third since 2022. And this was attributed in loads of papers to the creation of ChatGPT. Now, The reality of that was utter nonsense. There was absolutely zero causation attached, in the sense of ChatGPT gets created and suddenly these entry-level jobs disappear. And in fact, if you look at some of the data available at the moment, Financial Times has just been publishing it on AI adoption. Only 16% of UK companies have adopted generative AI into their work, or at least comfortable with kind of saying that in a sort of formal sense. And so I think, if that's where they are at now, it's stretching credibility a bit to say that, from 2022, loads of these entry-level jobs were being taken away by AI, and there's very little evidence that that's happened, certainly in the UK. So I think what's often kind of happening is people are conflating general kind of big macroeconomic changes, sometimes like political choices, and how that affects the data, and then trying to kind of attribute it to something that is very of the moment and flavour of the month. So if we look at like the longer term data around jobs in the UK, what we can kind of see is that post-COVID, there was what Charlie Ball, the labour market specialist, has described as almost like a sugar rush of hiring. So the economy opened back up. Loads of employers realised, thanks to things like, the coronavirus business support scheme and furlough and all these sort of things, that actually the economy was better than people thought it was. They could go and hire. They needed to kind of fill their talent pipelines. And there was this big, almost like artificial spike in hiring, particularly in areas like tech and things like that. And then naturally, as the economy essentially went on a downturn, having to kind of pay back all the stuff after COVID, other geopolitical factors, but it feels as though that's kind of been a much more significant dip because of the spike that came originally. And then I think it's people's tendency to try and attach things to a narrative that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
So they hear a story about AI taking away work from one particular person in one particular industry, and then they attach that to everything. And so I think, the mainstream media and social media has got a really big role to play in this. And unfortunately, they're not playing a very positive role, or haven't played a very positive role. And a lot of it is very sensationalist. So in terms of what we actually know and what we can actually kind of prove at the moment, and we should have to caveat all of this by saying that, it's very early days. And actually a lot of live data probably isn't going to keep up with what's actually happening with AI adoption and implementation, because a lot of this is happening very quickly. And if you look at kind of things like the data that's available from Centre for AI Safety and places like that around the ability of tasks to be automated, we could definitely argue that we might not see the indicators early enough, because if work is being taken away from, say, freelancers, or work is being taken away from people that would have been hired by small and medium-sized businesses because they can now do more of this stuff themselves, that may not show up in the data early enough in comparison to, say, like graduate hiring, where there are big employers that always hire every year. You can keep a better track of it. But if we actually look at the data that's out there, what we can kind of really see is that there hasn't been this collapsing of the entry-level jobs market that we've heard, certainly in the graduate space in the UK. For the entry-level jobs reduction, a lot of that has kind of come down to choices. So some of it has been down to like overarching costs, like energy, business rates. The UK government last year raised national insurance on employers, and a lot of people took decisions not to hire on that basis. And we've heard some companies now, like PwC, coming back and saying, we're actually going to hire more graduates this year. And the reasons that we weren't hiring was due to the business landscape and not due to AI. So it is variable. It's very, very hard to generalize across industries. And it's very dangerous, I think, for us to make guarantees or promises. But I think that idea that the entry-level jobs market is totally collapsed and cratered, certainly not because of AI, that I think is something we need to challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's, those myths, and, we rail against them all the time. Dr. Jim Bright talks about what's generally right is specifically wrong. But generally trends are so much easier to latch onto and repeat. We're still battling that one here in Australia around, we hear students go, we're going to have 17 jobs across 5 careers. It's, again, generally right, specifically wrong. It's not something useful or relevant. But I think when we're talking about how AI is impacting jobs and roles at the task level, that might be worth just clarifying, because I think sometimes we still hear, AI is taking the jobs, but what's actually happening is, the impact is variable on different tasks within different jobs to different amounts. So whether it's, automating or augmenting or adding jobs and tasks. Do you think that's understood?
No, and I don't think it's understood by companies, and I don't think it's understood by individuals, and I don't really think it's understood by policymakers. And I think it's partly because it's still a very developing area. So I think it would be comforting, I think, for people to think like they've got a handle on it. And I think in some respects, if you look at like the Microsoft Work Trends report for this year, they talk about, the 19% of companies that are sort of frontier AI users. You might say, okay, are those companies that have got a pretty good sense of, where in their workflow do they use AI? Where do they choose not to use it? Do they have, fully automated processes, policies around that? What does that look like? But actually, like we know that generally speaking, across, like I was saying earlier with that data, 16% of UK companies have, formally adopted AI. There's a lot of shadow usage of AI, so people using commercial systems to kind of do their work and just not telling their companies about it because maybe they find that Copilot isn't as useful as using OpenAI Codework or Claude Code or those sort of things. So I think there's a lot of messiness within there. I think the idea of kind of exposure is quite interesting as well. So Anthropic kind of brought out a report you might have seen last year where it was looking at the different sort of areas of industry that were more exposed or potentially more exposed in the future to AI. And Sarah O'Connor at the Financial Times talks very well about this and writes very well about this in this idea that what do we mean by exposure? Yes, an element of your job could be done by AI, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, number one, it's going to be, because there are a lot of different things in the way before that can happen. So in a small company, for example, in a startup or a scale up, where you've suddenly realized that maybe you no longer need or feel you no longer need graphic design or web design capability because you're able to do this with paid commercial tools, that potentially takes some work away from freelancers or contracted employees. And that's quite hard to pick up in the data. If you were to try and do something similar in a much larger organization, it's quite difficult because actually you've already got people in those roles who are maybe using AI to do that. If they're improving their output, then actually that's not necessarily displacing their job. If anything, it's kind of making them potentially more valuable, more employable to the company. So that's just two really simple examples, but you can easily kind of see from that it could be quite variable depending on the size of the organization. The work ecosystem is much bigger than just here is a distinct task, automate it, job done. So I think, yes, of course, there's going to be private companies who come out and say, look, we're going to reduce loads of our workforce and use AI instead. It's been quite prominent with the big tech companies. And of course, that's great marketing for them. Look what we've managed to do. But you've also then seen companies like IBM who've tripled their hiring in the US. And they've used AI for years, and they've said, "Look, well, actually, we can do more."
Yeah.
Management consulting, they were worried that would disappear forever, and now we're starting to see all these consultancies pivot to AI. And so, that there is this element of, yes, we don't know exactly how it's going to play out with job losses, job gains, huge new industries like AI safety. What will that look like? But I think there is this level of it's sometimes spoken about very reductively and very simplistically. And actually, the truth is that probably we don't know just yet exactly how that's going to shake out.
And that's always been the case. We don't know. We can't predict the future. There's never been a crystal ball. But I think it's that collective uncertainty that we're all going through it at once rather than one industry or one demographic going through this massive disruption.
I think news in itself is so fragmented at the moment. Like, it's really a choose your own adventure where you get your news from. And I was wondering if you could give any insight to, the people who are listening about trusted sources who are reporting honestly in this space. I think, any one of us are seeing the sort of inflated headlines and reporting about this, and then the sort of panic it's causing. Who are you turning to as trusted sources who are reporting and watching what's emerging from this transition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are probably two parts to it for me. So there's the sort of the big picture data side of things. So actually, like, how are we seeing data change over time, over maybe 3 to 5 year window, and what's happening there? So I tend to use kind of a few different sources for sort of big picture data. And then I think with kind of AI and what's happening in industry, I think that's where the context really matters. So there are some really good overarching sources. So if you follow things like Anthropic have got their economic index, which basically is kind of quarterly, and it shows any businesses that are using Claude, how are they using them across different industries? And, it's by Anthropic, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt. It's somewhat of a marketing tool for them. But that's quite interesting in terms of in a slightly more time-sensitive way, keeping up with kind of how things are changing and the different use cases we're seeing within, say, the creative industries versus finance versus consultancy, etc. But I think, yeah, for me, the most trusted sources you can find from an industry perspective typically come from within that industry. So recently we've had a really interesting report from the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre in the UK. And this was based on a kind of a workforce survey they did. Hundreds of freelancers, hundreds of creative industries employers and professionals kind of across the UK. And they've sort of been able to kind of create these skills audits across 11 different subsectors. So architecture, video games, crafts, all sorts of different things. And they've been able to break down the kind of skills requirements into sort of technical, so very specific to that area, that subsector. So that might be, for example, the use of like 3D CAD, if you were talking about architecture. It might be like particular kind of physical processes, if you're talking about crafts and those sort of things, and jewelry making, for example. So they've got the kind of technical side, they've got the digital skills, so that could be anything from generative AI to Microsoft Excel. They've got the kind of transversal skills, so what we might call like transferable skills, the communication, the problem solving. And then they look at business critical skills, so that might be like people management, it might be fundraising, it might be client analysis, those sort of things. And so I think this is a really nice way to do it, but these sort of reports I think really help you drill down into what are we actually seeing in industry and trying to avoid those kind of big headlines where a prominent person's come out and said there won't be any jobs in graphic design. Well, actually, what does that mean? So I think it's always really important that we kind of take that sort of like macro down to micro view. Okay, have we got trusted big data sources we can kind of follow that show the long-term changes in the job market? But then also, are we going down to that kind of slightly more micro level and going, what's happening in this specific industry I'm interested in? And then actually having conversations with people on the ground to go, how is it affecting their day-to-day work? Because again, it's happening very differently for different people across different industries and different job roles. And as much as we talk about digital natives, actually all of us are going through this generative AI revolution at the same time.
And Chris, do you want to talk about the tool that you've built from that data?
One of the things it does is sort of starts to give us kind of an indication across these 4 skills categories of basically what is it that is going to be in demand in the future? What are the kind of different buckets of skills that are going to be important across different sort of subsectors in the creative industries? And so, again, using AI is a really good example, I think, of where it can be quite, contextually useful. I've been looking at ways to help visualize that for students, for the academics that I work with. So kind of using these reports and using ChatGPT, I've been able to kind of build these skills dictionaries. And so some of this is extrapolated directly from the reports and some of it is kind of extrapolated from context. So what they talk about in the reports, but don't specifically mention as a skill. And using those kind of skills dictionaries, I've then been able to kind of create this visual dashboard, which allows basically students, academic staff to almost, I suppose, like reflect on what they're seeing in terms of, do we feel these skills are a fair reflection on what's happening in interior design or illustration? Do we feel there's some stuff in there that doesn't make sense? Do we feel there's some stuff that might be missing that kind of exists in the course? And so using that as a different way to kind of visualize how do these skills exist basically within the creative industries, maybe how do they overlap and I guess intersect with other subsectors in the creative industries? And I guess just sort of to access that information in a slightly different way.
Yeah, we'll definitely share that. It's so good. I was playing with it this week and just seeing it in a different way is really useful for working with students. When we go back just to that promise of, good grades, go to uni, get a great job, has it ever been true? And is it any less true now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think career development professionals, I guess we are used to dealing with or helping people kind of deal with uncertainty or navigate uncertainty. And so I think the avoidance of easy promises is kind of quite an important thing for us to focus on generally. I don't think that the promise as it was has ever been true. I think that's always been kind of a confected story. I think it's been partly used to reassure people who've made that decision. So if we think about going to university, there was a point where, 3%, 5% of the population were going, where kind of a degree really was a massive point of difference. It just wasn't, it wasn't something that many people did. Whereas, now, we have a much higher percentage going. And it's one of those things where, was it ever the case that a degree was an absolute guarantee of moving into something? No, it never has been. And I think having that sort of line takes away a lot of agency and a lot of proactivity from people. And I think that's problematic because, thinking that you just have to come and do something like it's on rails and you don't really need to engage or think about how you're engaging, that is really problematic in any training or qualification pathway. There's no real agency or proactivity in that approach. It's just almost tick a box and I'll be fine. And for some people, that may have been the case in the past. And I think, that's where you hear those stories and it allows people to kind of imagine that myth was real. But yeah, I don't think it was ever real. I think what's kind of really important is we try and get away from things like, university versus apprenticeship arguments. I think the landscape is often very complex. People are often almost required to make decisions very quickly. We certainly see that at university level, making a pretty big decision pretty early on in your career, and having to kind of basically stand by that quite early in your career to say this is going to be worth the £50,000 of debt, and it's going to be worth the 3 years of my life plus. So I think there is this really significant need for better decision making, and actually being able to give people the support so that when they're thinking about what they do, they are kind of going, well, actually, this is me. I am actively making a decision. When I go and do this training or qualification pathway, this is going to be on me. I'm going to have to make the most of this. I'm going to have to get the most out of this. So for that reason, does this feel like the right next step for me right now? And I think that's the bit that's so often missing. And obviously career guidance plays a big role in that. So yeah, I think the promise has kind of never been true. I think, we should naturally steer clear of easy promises. I've seen, hundreds of people who've had huge amount of value out of doing a traditional university pathway, some with placement years, some without. I've worked with hundreds of people who've gone down apprenticeship routes from level 2 all the way up to level 7 degree apprenticeships, who've had loads of value out of those routes, and some who've kind of gone down completely different routes. They've done, short courses, they've done boot camps, they've done on-the-job training. So, there are pathways that can work for everybody. And so I think we're better sometimes avoiding anything that kind of counts as an easy promise, and stick to more kind of helping people make better decisions.
Obviously, in the podcast, one of the reasons we started this is because we initially started collaborating while I was in a schooling role. It was a system role, actually, that looked across, K to 12 schooling. And, one of the points at which Liv and I really connected on was about how the totality of the school experience actually contributes to a young person's career development. I think one of the things that Liv and I have both seen in schools is the story of the teacher teaching a disengaged student, the student putting their hand up and saying, what is the point of learning maths? And for a long time, the subject specialists would reach for the same kind of responses and say, these skills are critical. You will use numeracy in your life. Here are all the posters on my wall that show all the careers that are on offer. Schools have this huge push to make learning relevant for the real world. But the real world is changing faster than we can plan, faster than we can design curriculum, faster than we can make some of those connections. If you were a teacher in a classroom right now and a student said, so what is the point of this? What would your response be to that? And what are some of the things that teachers can say right now rather than just holding on to the old rhetoric?
Yeah, I think I would probably respond first of all and say that's a fair question, because I think, we should be encouraging anybody to take agency in their life and to ask those type of questions. I think it's totally reasonable. Now, the to be able to kind of change a curriculum at the pace that the world is changing, the lack of stability and consistency for learners, the lack of comparability year on year between what students were achieving in terms of qualifications would be absolute nonsense. So it's just not possible, right? Even in universities where in theory you'd think that they can move quicker, that process of like course redesign, curriculum review, it can take a number of years and to have everything approved and kind of put in place. So there is this need to absolutely to connect things to the real world, which I'll kind of come back to. But I think this idea that, school is meant to be like a finishing school for you becoming a unit of labour in whatever industry happens to be doing well at this point in time is complete, to me, absurdity. It's like, if anything, it makes the case more for education that is balanced and well-rounded and includes all of the different things that, will give us the ability to pursue whatever comes up in the future. So that includes the liberal arts, it includes the creative arts, it includes STEM, it includes language, communication, oracy, all those sort of things. I think that arguably is more important. And when you throw in philosophy, sociology, psychology, the ability to understand how the world works and to kind of consider your place within that, I think that stuff arguably becomes more important. Knowledge is the foundation that allows you to be able to make decisions about things and to think critically and to be able to kind of discern why something is happening, to discern whether information is useful or not useful, how you might use that information ethically. You can't do any of that without knowledge. And so I think when we hear people talk about, well, AI is going to give, knowledge at people's fingertips, I think it's quite disingenuous, because it isn't knowledge, it's information. And if we don't know the quality of that information, if we don't really know what that's telling us, if we haven't had a foundation in understanding all these things, I think what we're getting is not really knowledge, we're just getting information. And it can really make people feel, I think, much cleverer than they are and much more knowledgeable than they are, when actually, they're actually quite in hoc to information they're getting back from really an unverified source. I think in the UK here, one of the big issues that we've had is over focus on exams, potentially, not necessarily like the method of exams, but just in terms of exam results. I think that pressure on teachers and schools to achieve certain levels of exam results, and that being the thing that's kind of held over them by government, by Ofsted, by maybe prospective parents coming to schools, those sorts of things. I think that has caused a pressure which then takes away some of the creativity from teachers. And then I think alongside that, there are lots of ways that you can then tie that into the real world through careers education. And there are some great examples of this in the UK that have been done with kind of, sort of teacher sabbaticals or like industry visits, like getting teachers to be a bit more connected to their subject in the real world. So I think having conversations about what is happening out there, if you will, outside the school walls, has always been important. But I think in terms of what students learn within there, yes, a broad, creative, kind of mixed portfolio of subjects, I think for me is the really important thing, because actually you're never going to be able to keep up with all the change that happens in the world. And I think, educational institutions definitely have a role to play with this, 100%. So a good careers education program that supports their teaching staff to feel that they can talk more about, where this knowledge exists in the world and where it's being applied and how it's solving the world's problems. Like, all of that is great. Having a strong careers program that, brings in industry speakers, gives opportunities for work experience, like all these things absolutely help.
If you could say something to teachers and school leaders about things they should keep doing or start doing or stop doing in this time of transition and destabilization, what would you say?
First of all, I'd probably say keep up the great work, because I've worked with lots of teachers and I work with lots of academics in my current role, and I think it's become an ever more complicated job in the modern era. I think there is a lot within teaching now, that maybe didn't used to exist there. There's so much more focus on pastoral support. There's so many more expectations of what you're able to deliver. So I think, first of all, I would say keep it up and don't panic. I think the biggest thing is conversations, but to basically improve that baseline of what makes a good careers conversation. So I think for me that the key thing I would say is, there's lots of stuff that careers leaders and school leaders, senior leaders can do in terms of establishing quality careers programs. Use the careers advisor or careers professional in your school, careers leader. What does a careers conversation need to look like for you as a teacher to basically just help open these ideas up for young people? I think the space needs to be there for kind of actual honest conversations about what's happening in the world, and encouraging young people to be curious and go home and talk about that with their parents if they can, or talk about it with their peers, and actually take an active interest in the world rather than feel like a passive passenger that is just having this stuff done to them. And actually, conversation can make such a big difference. I think people don't always realise.
Well, yeah, because at the heart of schooling and education is connection. It's that relationship. We remember our teachers, we remember the points at which we disagreed, but also where we connected and where we were inspired. I was wondering what you would say to a student who is that despondent, sort of looking ahead and going, I didn't sign up for this, and this is not, the life I thought I had ahead of me. Are there any reasons for our students to be optimistic? And what would you say to that kid who's just sort of questioning everything?
Yeah, I do think there are reasons to be optimistic. I think it's very easy to see the media narrative and, as you say, feel very despondent and feel like there's no agency that you have. There's no way that you can affect the situation. All this stuff is happening to you. I think, for kind of teachers and educators and careers professionals to keep challenging that is something that we need to do. For parents and carers, it's, again, also challenging that, because I think we all get drawn into easy narratives sometimes. But I think for a student, I would say this is a potentially exciting period in history and in time. I think the author Benjamin Todd, who is the founder of 80,000 Hours, was talking about this on a podcast recently. And his kind of view is that actually the big industry that people should start looking into is AI safety. And that kind of connects somewhat into ethics and philosophy and governance, because actually, you know, this could be a technology that dominates potentially the rest of this century. We don't know. But what we do know is that based on news stories, we are seeing things that have actually happened, like the recent OpenAI kind of hacking scandal. You know, what we know is that this is going to be an issue that affects all of us, and it's going to be something that we have to kind of wrap our heads around in organizations, in day-to-day life. So I think that there's that element, that there's some kind of quite, you know, developing, exciting things that actually, you know, you can be a part of because it's not yet a developed industry. I think certainly for kind of people starting a business or having business ideas, the barrier to entry of delivering stuff has changed significantly with AI. I think if you think about the cost of an £18 a month license for a Claude or an OpenAI, for that now people can kind of do some really impressive things in terms of building stuff for themselves, building really like novel apps, websites, tools, thinking of a problem that you couldn't solve before and being able to do that. So I think there's some really exciting potential in the technology space. But I also think as well that the focus now moving more towards, as you mentioned earlier, Liv, human skills, means that actually if you are somebody who, you know, you feel like, you know, I don't particularly like kind of technology in that sense, I wouldn't want to work with technology, there are going to be a lot of opportunities, I think, for people to do that translation work and, you know, to feed into that need for uniquely human experiences. And it's interesting that we're seeing this from even some of the biggest proponents of technology. So Stephen Bartlett, people will know, a very famous podcaster in the UK, Diary of a CEO, has interestingly started doing live in-person events in recognition that there is more demand for this. And so I think, you know, a lot of this, we don't know how it's going to shake out, but I think we are at kind of, I guess, an inflection point, right? Things are changing all the time. That can also be an opportunity as much as it can be scary. And I think, you know, when you're younger, your brain is much more like a sponge. It's much quicker for you to be able to pick up things. And so I think this is a time where you can kind of say, actually, even if I've got a slight interest in something, follow that thread. You don't need to know where that thread leads necessarily, but the world, organizations, businesses are always going to need curious people who enjoy learning, who are basically passionate about something or interested in something and happy to talk about that, and people that can create value, that can solve problems, whatever that looks like. So I think, you know, there is absolutely reason for optimism, but I think that involves sometimes kind of turning off the noise and focusing on what matters to you or things that you're interested in, even if you don't know whether they matter to you just yet, rather than kind of getting hooked into, should I do this because it's appearing in the press? Should I do this because I read a report about it? Because I think that way will only lead you to very reductive decision making.
Love that.
So good. I think the both of us could safely say we could probably speak to you for another hour and a half. I just want to say thank you, Chris. I'm one of your many subscribers. I'm not a career development practitioner, but I genuinely really appreciate, you know, it's one of my data points that feeds into my work and how I work with schools. So thank you for what you put out there, and thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Chris. I love the themes of curiosity and agency coming through for schools. I think is, you know, if we could wish one thing for our students, it would be curiosity. And if they had that and could see all this complexity and the challenges in the world, then as like you say, the challenges turn into, wow, there's a lot of things to fix in this world. Let's get to
100%.
it. Like the world's to-do list is very long. The jobs are not going to disappear.
No, I think that's a really good way of framing it. That yes, we're not going to run out of problems to fix. The question is which problem and where do you fit in with that? So it's a really good point.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Chris. I think when I reflect back on our chat with Chris, I think that we really have to critically analyze who is reporting on this, who is benefiting from this kind of reporting, and how are we sort of reacting to it. You and I talk about how the world has always been chaotic. You know, it's always been unpredictable. You and I were talking about that article about tracking by the time our kids leave school, they'll be doing jobs that never existed.
Yes.
And how how this person tracked back where that phrase originated. And it turned out I think it was Clinton or Reagan or someone may have said it in a speech.
Just in a throwaway comment.
And I remember talking to a group of kids and they were saying, oh, but we've got to prepare for jobs that don't exist. And at that time I was in my project role. And I said, yeah, but this job didn't exist when I was at school.
Yeah.
It's kind of just how the labour market works. We create jobs in response to what we need.
Yeah.
And so some of these claims I think that we make that read as alarmist, we really have to critically analyse how much weight we give to that kind of stuff and whether we have the evidence to support whether young people will have 8 careers over their lifetime.
I think it also plays into that kind of anxiety it's all causing, and the whole that report that had come out from the Rest is Politics UK podcast around the Gen Z anxiety and the doom and gloom kind of series. But I think, when you're talking to those young kids about, we have to prepare for these jobs, or I've certainly heard so many teachers and students go, well, we're going to have 17 jobs across 5 careers. It makes it sound like they're the first generation who've had any disruption. And it makes it sound scary, and it makes it sound like a new thing. Because we want some big stats to hang on to and to know what's happening. But then they go, oh, well, life is rubbish for us. It's our prospect of, we're going to have it tougher than anyone else. And they think of it as a collective as well, rather than me as an individual. How do I navigate this? And I thought Chris's comments on that as an individual, that that pathway, that traditional pathway A is the best, has never been right for everyone, and it will never be right for everyone. And it comes down to those career development fundamentals. It's about designing a future that's right for you based on who you are and the unique person you are. So yeah, it was great to go, what do we really know and what do we not know at all? And I think that when I was thinking over the weekend about what's the takeaways for educators, that was one of the things that really popped out for me. What were you thinking?
So many things. I think a key takeaway for me was, who do we put our trust in the voices who are speaking about this, and how easy it is to sort of make these these abstractions, I don't know if that's the right word, just based on limited bits of information. It made me think of a podcast I'd listened to recently, and we might link it in the show notes if anyone's interested as well. Professor Joel Pearson is the world's first neurofuturist and is really looking at how society is sort of shifting, because of the disruption of AI. And he was saying that our cortisol goes up. We become stressed as soon as we are uncertain. We just start getting anxious. And so there's this epidemic of that at the moment because we are all feeling really uncertain. And it made me think about how I should be really, really discerning about who I put my trust in. I think if I was a school leader right now, how that would then inform the work that we're doing and the strategy and the future that we're imagining in our school.
I loved your question to Chris about who should we trust, because I think, as I mentioned, that teacher said, like, what do we do to give hope? And you just dive into all these reports. So it was really good to go, actually, what is the actual data, and that data literacy to go, what does this mean? Where's the AI washing? Well, how does this sit against the general trends and the backdrop? So I think that was a really good point about getting more discerning about steady sources. And I think looking over the long term to see the patterns is really important rather than one-off reports. And really that the solid theme running through, I think, and every time our conversation gets back to this, how does the individual navigate it? There is no right answer. We don't know. But all we can do is go, what are the skills that you need to be able to navigate it with open eyes and see your own future and move forward into your future? So it comes back to agency again, every time, curiosity and agency.
To know that there are still steps you can take forward.
Yes.
I mean, it is a collective uncertainty that we're all experiencing. But I go back to, things that I think you and people like Jim Bright have been speaking about for a long time, and that the world has always been chaotic and unpredictable. Every generation has experienced disruption and has had to evolve and navigate change. Yes, the change that is happening at the moment is exponential, and for a lot of it, we have no frame of reference for it, but it doesn't mean that we are stuck. I was remembering a book that I read last year called Imaginable by Professor Jane McGonigal, who is a games designer and a futurist. One of the huge takeaways from her book is that we still can create the future that we want. Just because the predictions and the doom and gloom and all of these things can sort of take up our cognitive space doesn't mean that, like you said, we still don't have agency. If that's a future that we don't want, then we can take steps to create the one that we do want. And I think it applies for young people in the same way that it applies for school leaders. So, practically, I think it's worth thinking in your school team, where are you having these conversations? Where are you naming the uncertainty? I've been a long time believer that every school should have someone whose role it is to do the work of strategic foresight and futures thinking. And it's a huge part of why it's a core discipline in the work of Coherence CoLab, because as school leaders, as educators, we need to see the future that's emerging and then know, is that the future we want to create? And if not, then what are we going to do in our strategy to maintain our openness and awareness to it, but then take steps to adapt and evolve as the future changes. So I think my practical recommendation is to really think about how we make space for that in our regular strategic communication as leadership teams and as school staff. I would really recommend Jane McGonigal's book as a starting point for futures literacy, and then I can link to some other things from UNESCO about how to use futures thinking in work. And one of the things that I have done that I would absolutely recommend is that, the technology exists now for me to set up my own futures scan that I do once a week. I've used AI to set it up. I've given it the parameters and the theoretical framework, so it's not just the AI, telling me what is happening without any substance. And I do that once a week to, for my own work and my own practice with schools, so that I have an openness and awareness of the future in the work that I do. And so, that's, if you want to do something like that, reach out. I'm more than happy to share how I did that. But yeah, I don't think we can be afraid of it. I don't think we can put our head in the sand. I think we still have agency, and I think the schools who just make space for some of that uncertainty and that shift that's happening, I think will be the ones that evolve.
I think that's awesome at the leadership level. And how good if it was like a weekly 10-minute slot in the ELT of what did our futures scan bring to us this week?
What are the signals we're seeing? Yeah, absolutely.
I think for okay, so zooming in for how it plays out in the classroom and in career conversations and everyday conversations, I think the biggest takeaway for me is to look at the language and the myths that we're not maliciously or intentionally, but perpetuating that aren't very helpful. So I would almost love for schools to go, what does everyone think they know about the future? So the 17 jobs across 5 careers, and half the kindy kids will do jobs that don't exist yet. What are those blanket statements that are just not very helpful? Let's put them all in the bin and actually go, what do we know and what don't we know from a real perspective, with things that will be useful. So the mechanics that we do know are how AI will impact work. So that is task level, not uniformly, not at the job level. It will create, augment, or reduce or eliminate at the job level. So just breaking that simple, like, this is how it's happening, this is how it's having impact, just for everyone to understand that. And therefore, what can you do in the face of that? Because there's more complexity, and the pathway is more complexity, and there's more choice than ever. That is a massive opportunity if we learn how to navigate it and think about it. My other one that I loved, the biggest takeaway from the conversation, was when we were talking with Chris about, what creates jobs and problems, and the world's to-do list creates jobs. And if we're all anxious about all the problems we can see in the world, that naturally means there's going to be lots of work and lots of things to work on. So I think that's, as a very simple look, the world is not blowing up. There's going to be a lot for you guys theirs to do. So again, get moving, get active. Where are you going to play a role?
Yeah, and who I think, if I was a careers leader in this space, I would also be thinking, well, if there is this despondency or this lack of hope amongst the students I'm talking to, I would really think about who can I bring in? Who can my students speak with? Who is in this space seeing the industry change, but can offer, like sort of a grounded, realistic sense of all is not lost. We are changing and learning in real time. And this is why your creativity and your agility matters more than ever.
Yes.
I think we have to, it's one of my favorite lines actually in one of the OECD papers from the Career Readiness Project, where they said one of the things we really have to do is make the walls between the classroom and the outside world more porous.
Yes.
And that, I think, matters now more than ever.
Well, that is a good link to one of our upcoming episodes as well, and connecting careers to the curriculum and making those classroom walls more porous.
Yeah,
I love that. I think that was Anthony Mann, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Give Andreas Schleicher the credit for everything, but I'm pretty sure that was Anthony Mann.
He should come on and talk to us, actually.
Yes. I'm sure he will.
And that is it for today's episode of the Great Careers Programme. If this one made you think, the best thing you can do is to share it with someone else in your school who needs to hear it. We'd love your help in getting this to more people and helping more people find us. So if you've listened and found this valuable, leave us a rating or a review wherever you listen and share it with your staff room, your friends, your network.
And you can also find episode recaps, research links, everything that we talk about in the episodes over on our Substack. It's the best place to go deeper on everything that we cover here. Liv, do you want to tell the listeners about the Take It to the Meeting resource that we designed?
Yes, so every episode we have committed to doing something that allows you to take it further. So if you want to take the insights or ideas from these podcast episodes and turn them into real action for your school or system, head over to the Substack and you can download a 10-minute team meeting activity. Just as we zoom into practice and zoom out to the systems perspective in each podcast, there's always one resource focused on developing practice with students for any team meeting and another one for looking at the bigger picture to take to leadership meetings. So pick and choose your adventure.
Or do both. Do you remember that?
Or do both.
Do you remember that taco ad? Why not both?
¿Por qué no?
Yeah.
No, ¿por qué no los dos?
Listeners, we want to hear from you. If you know a job or a career that nobody's ever heard of, something weird, niche, cool, surprising, something that might even add to my heck no list, please send us an email over at hi@thegreatcareersprogram.com. We'd love to feature it and we'd love to have you tell us all about it.
The Great Careers Programme is a collaboration between Become Education and Coherence Collab. It's hosted by me, Liv Penny, and my co-host Marianne Wright, with production support from Bev Lang. Music is by Chad Crouch, and you'll find links to everything we mentioned in the show notes and on Substack. And you can follow us on socials, on Instagram and YouTube. We'll see you next time. Bye!
Bye!